Hello and welcome back to the Matrix Green Pill podcast. I'm your host, Hilmarie. Leadership transitions are often seen as moments of opportunity. A new role, a bigger mandate, a chance to make an impact. But behind the opportunity lies the reality many organizations underestimate. Transitions are one of the highest risk moments in leadership because success in a new role isn't just about capability. It's about how quickly a leader can adapt, align, and deliver under pressure. Today's guest has built his career around mastering that critical window. Navid Nazemian is a globally recognized executive coach who has worked with over 250 C-level leaders worldwide, helping them navigate transitions, avoid derailment, and accelerate their impact. His work challenges conventional thinking around onboarding and highlights the hidden risks and opportunities that define leadership success in the first months of a new role. Navid, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Hilmarie. I've been looking forward to our conversation.
Navid, you spend your life helping the world's most powerful leaders navigate their turning points. But before we dive into the staggering ROI of a well-managed transition, I'd like to begin with your own green pill moment. Could you share an inspiring or life-changing experience that you have gone through, your green pill moment?
Oh, wow, Hilmarie, you want to go right in there? Sure. So one of my so-called green pill moments came quite early in my executive career. I won't mention the name of the company, but this is when I experienced how being rewarded for certainty, strength, and performance started to disconnect me slowly from myself and others. And so if you had looked at my career progression up until that date, everything looked perfect on paper. But if I'm perfectly honest, deep inside, I was operating on autopilot. So I was making decisions from habit and expectation rather than from a place of awareness. And it was only during a major transition that I felt that, oh, okay, this is what's happening. All the familiar markers of identity are being stripped away. And I realized in that moment how easily, top level achievement can actually come at the cost of presence, humility, and deep human connections. So that moment really shaped or reshaped how I coach, how I lead, and how I define success.
Wow, that's a powerful shift in perspective. It reminds us that even at the highest levels, the human operating systems needs more than just performance metrics to thrive. It perfectly sets the stage for understanding the human element behind the high-level strategies we are about to discuss. So let's jump right into talking about your book. First of all, congratulations on the success of your book. You spent 7 years meticulously researching and writing your book, Mastering Executive Transition, which is also an international bestseller. What was the driving force or the specific industry frustration that made you dedicate nearly a decade to writing the book?
I'm a typical ambitious kind of type person. And when the idea that I wanted to write and publish my own book, I thought of it to be a year-long project. I mean, really, what is the big deal? I mean, I'm talking about a book project. It's a subject that I feel deeply passionate about. It's a subject matter expertise area that I feel decently knowledgeable about. Let's face it, I mean, I'm pretty good in hitting my KPIs and numbers otherwise. So what's the big deal? That's what I thought of this book project. And then, as they say, Hilmarie, life just gets in the way. That was a particularly dynamic time in my executive career. I changed companies, I changed industries, and I changed countries all at the same time. A year into the process of trying to write a book, our son was born. And I was full on in my executive role. I was traveling the world. I was in a global position. So I had 24 markets to look after. I'm a husband, I'm a father, and I'm a full-time HR leader. And so the amount of time I can actually give to this project is very little. And I really underestimated how hard it is to write a full book. Previous to this, I had written 2 single chapters to other people's books. And I thought that effort to be times 10 or 12, but how wrong I was. And so that's just part of the truth that life just got in the way. And I did not want to settle on expectations, on the research side of it. I did not want to settle on the number of executives that I interviewed for this work. And really, I mean, doing the deep work that you do need to do if you really want to write a book that has substance and endures various trends that may emerge and die down as quickly as they did.
Your experience is clearly an example that you only learn through doing. Watching other people do things or seeing other people do things is not going to necessarily translate into one's own experience. And as you mentioned, all the external factors, changing companies, changing industries, countries, having children, impacts everything else. So that is again why it took you the time. But as you say, you certainly have the experience, you've got the knowledge to then have created something that is impacting so many people. You often quote William Bridges saying that in transition, we are most completely alive. Yet you also note that this is a period of extreme vulnerability. Why is it that even a battle-hardened C-suite veteran experiences such emotional volatility during a transition? And what is the glitch in their psychology that makes them feel like an imposter during those first few weeks?
So there are many things that typically get in the way, and that's part of the sad reality of the research that I conducted on the topic. And the research points out very clearly that 4 out of 10 executives do not make it. And the first time I came across this number, I thought, surely this must be a typo, a mistake of some kind. Maybe it's 14%, maybe it's even 4%. But the reality is there are 5 independent studies that point to this high transition failure rate, which kind of gets us into this interesting question of what actually gets in the way. I mean, how can it be? As someone who's worked in the human resources domain for 20 years exactly, I certainly know, Hilmarie, what effort, energy, and dedication and the level of care that goes into these top level appointments. I mean, you often work with a search firm to make sure that you have really checked out the entire globe for the best candidate, even though you may have an internal lead candidate for the same position. They on their own often do a psychometric or an assessment of some kind just to make sure that the candidate is legitimate. They then go and do reference checks and background checks and all sorts of different checks to make sure that the candidate really is what they say on paper they are. And then there are multiple interview rounds. And usually, I mean, you don't hire a C-level executive just by conducting a single interview, but there are plenty of people who get involved. And despite all of that, 4 out of 10 don't make it. And so I actually dedicate an entire chapter to the top 10 reasons for executive transition failure. But as I often say it on podcasts like this, Hilmarie, it's the functional / the technical skills that gets you hired into the C-suite. And it's the lack of the so-called soft skills that gets you fired pretty quickly on the back end of that. Typically, reasons for executive transition failure are down to any of these 3 grouped reasons that all boil down to people, culture, and politics. So these are the top 3, group reasons for executive transition failure. And if I wanted to have one more insight, which is the good work of Dr. Marshall Goldsmith, someone who I have in high regards and someone who's kindly written a very kind foreword to my book, who himself has published 42 books. And one of those books has outsold the other 41. And that book is titled, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And this is part of the reason why so many transitions go wrong, because there is just this inherent human preference and nature to continue to repeat what's made us successful previously without necessarily realizing that as and when we shift the level of responsibility substantially, we probably need a new mix of skills and activities, and just taking out the old playbook and try to do it all over again exactly the way we did it is not going to cut it for us. And those are just some ideas around what can go wrong and why there is such a high failure rate at the executive level.
That's so interesting. As you say, the cookie cutter solution is not going to work. Interesting that how you said that functional technical skills is what gets people hired, but it's often the soft skills that get them fired. So as you mentioned, it comes down to people, culture, and politics. Let's talk about one of the things that can go wrong. You've observed that many organizations apply the same shop floor onboarding to the top floor. Beyond the paperwork and the office tour, what is the fundamental structural flaw in how boards abandon their new leaders the moment the contract is signed?
So this goes back to the notion of, even though many organizations these days are doing a fantastic job in what I would call a general onboarding program. And let's face it, I mean, the general onboarding program probably works for about 99.5% of the total population. But as soon as you look at the C-suite, I think it's highly unlikely that the newly appointed CEO is going to sit in the same classroom kind of format with the new admin that's, hired into the HR or finance department, who is being taught about what is the strategy of this organization, what are the functions, and who are the leaders and what have you. Again, if you look at the research, and I'm citing Genesis Advisors here, if you look at admin arrangement, if you look at a general business orientation day or two, and the legal and procedural formalities, 9 out of 10 companies get those right. But if you start to move a little higher in the value chain in what I call higher value activities, you see how the numbers keep dropping further and further. The further you go up, the more the number keeps dropping. So when you look at things like aligning expectations with teams and bosses, so imagine this is the new CEO coming in and the company making sure that there is alignment with the chair of the board, as well as with the C-suite that is going to be inherited by this new group CEO. That is only done by 1 out of 2 companies. So 52% of the companies get this right. If you look at one higher value item, such as organizing meaningful meetings with key stakeholders. And by the way, if you wanted to do that, someone either in HR or some other person needs to sit down and map out the key positions in an organization. So let's say the C-suite roles, sometimes even the level below. And then to create meaningful stakeholder maps as to what does this role require in order to succeed fully. And that may include internal stakeholders, that may also include external stakeholders and others. So again, that is only done by 33% of the companies surveyed. So one out of 3 get this right. And then last but not least, if we look at meaningful facilitation of cultural traits, of the beliefs in the organization, just to make sure that the leader is grounded in familiarity with the culture of this organization that may be new to them if they're externally hired, only 29% get that right. These are just some examples around why the cookie cutter kind of onboarding approach, even though it may be operating at a very high level for the majority of your population, is nowhere near enough for the executive level.
That is really interesting research and findings that only 33% and only 28% of companies get it right. And I think that's so valuable for somebody at that C-suite level to have somebody who's mapping out those key stakeholders, for them to have those meaningful meetings right from the get-go. The industry gold standard has long been the first 90 days, but you've suggested this approach places an unfair solo burden on the leader. How does your philosophy shift the responsibility from a lonely hero narrative to a strategic organizational partnership?
I want to say this right up front, which is I do not want to belittle the idea and the brilliance that the first 90-day approach has. The simplicity of it is really remarkable. But the reality is, Hilmarie, that I myself have tried to make the first 90 days work at the executive level, and it has never worked. The short tenure and the simplicity of it is probably, as much as its biggest advantage for a first level manager, a first time leader, it's nowhere near sufficient for transitioning at the very top. So in terms of timeline, I think we are looking at 12 to 18 months. That's how long it takes a C-suite executive to really come to terms with what is my role, what is my remit? What is this company all about? Who are the key stakeholders? Who are the key competitors? What products and services do we offer? And what do we need to offer 3, 5, 10 years down the line in order to succeed? And so there's just this natural time that it takes for the executive to start to give back to the organization in a meaningful way. So the framework that I have introduced in my book is titled The Double Diamond Framework of Executive Transitions. And that framework consists of 7 phases that last 12 plus months. And only one out of the 7 phases is about the first 90 days. So that already should be an indicator around a first 90, 100, 120-day approach never being sufficient for being successful at the top level. And if I wanted to point out 2 more things about the Double Diamond Framework, phase 1 is often one of the highest neglected phases in any transition at the executive level. I call this phase Discover, and this is your typical minus 90 to day 0, meaning this is when you know that you will be the incoming CEO. Sometimes even the company knows because you have been announced, but technically you're not in your role yet. And that being said, I mean, this goes back to the great work of another gentleman. His name is Michael Burrows. And he wrote another great book that unfortunately didn't get to the same level of fame as the first 90 days did. And his book is called Before Onboarding: Critical Strategies to Apply Before You Were Appointed on Day 1. The idea that he had is that there are so many value-adding activities that you can start to do and demonstrate, even though you're technically not in the role yet, that once you go about doing those activities, you will have a head start compared to the other leader that is sitting on their hands, waiting for day 1, and then starts to run around like crazy, and then again drops the ball after 90 days because technically their onboarding phase is over. So that's just one additional angle I wanted to provide next to this being a 12 to 18 months phase journey and a 7-phase framework. And there are many more phases to any executive's transition career other than the first 90 days.
So what I'm hearing you saying is that there needs to be a shift, an adjustment of expectations, both for the board, the C-suite level, as well as the person coming in, the new CEO, the new hire in that position. Don't put that much pressure expecting miracles within the first 90 days. If you're more realistic in your expectations, it's going to take 12 to 18 months to make impact, if that's what you're saying.
Absolutely. And look, I mean, there are 3 other books who have been published on the back end of my book being on the market. Every single one of those books look at the topic through the CEO lens. So one of them is called The New CEO. It's written by a gentleman called Dr. Ty Wiggins. He's a senior search firm partner with Russell Reynolds Associates. Another one of those books, and I know him personally and met him, and I've got a nice copy of his book signed. There's another gentleman, his name is Dr. Claudius Hildebrand, a German guy, but works in the US, and he works for a competitor company called Spencer Stuart. His book is titled The Life Cycle of the CEO, and there's another book on the same as well. Every single one of them is suggesting to ditch the first 90 days and to look at a CEO transition in their cases, more like a 12 to 18 months journey. So that's the first myth that is being busted just the last 4 years. And this is how long my book has been out. And the other gentlemen's books have been out anywhere between 2 years and 1.5 years. The other angle I wanted to add to exactly the same thing is also, as you said, Hilmarie, there's also an element that the executive must get right? Again, if you come into the position, arguably you have been very successful previously. This is why you have been receiving this new level promotion. But if all you do is to, again, rely on past successes and hope that your old playbook is going to do it for you, well, let me tell you something. You have a 60% chance of succeeding and a 40% chance of failure.
Yes, so things definitely need to change to result in better success rates for incoming C-suite employees. I want to change the focus a little bit and look at through a gender lens. In your research, you've looked into whether organizations support male and female executives differently during these critical windows. What did you discover about the hidden biases that either accelerate or derail women in the C-suite compared to their male counterparts?
This is where my publisher sent me a very legally worded letter because I had just written an email to them to say, I really must make sure that I include this study into the book, and it's going to take me a couple more weeks to do that. That legal letter said, if you do not submit by this date, this is our final and last, letter on this, then this is the number you're looking to pay in terms of your compensation for breach of contract. So this is August 2021. DDI, this is Development Dimensions International, just published their so-called executive transition study. As every good study should do, right at the outset, you have to answer a number of questions about the demographics, and then you actually get to answer the questions of the study. And although this was not the intent of the study, it was just to make sure that they assign the findings to the right level of leadership and so on. They find out as a surprise finding, as a side finding, just by asking for the demographics right at the outset, that there is a gender gap between male executives and their female counterparts at the same level in organizations when it comes to being supported by the organization. And again, it just sounded like something very surprising to me because I know, as someone who's worked in the HR function, how much organizations really spend, huge amounts to advance and progress their female leaders to reach the same representation as their male counterparts. If I wanted to share just 3 concrete examples, so the percentage of executives who received a leadership skills training as part of the executive transition program, there is only 55% of the females who received this, and 62% of the male executives received the same support. So there's a 13% data point distance between the male and the females. If you look at the second ranked item, that's how many of those female or male executives are formally assessed using a diagnostic such as Hogan or leadership circle profile, something like that. And then that assessment and the debrief and the insights they gain from that are used to support the incoming transition, the upcoming transition. And so again, female executives stand at 48%. The male counterparts stand at 57%. So we're talking about a 19 percentage gap between female and male execs. And last but not least, what is the percentage of those male and female executives who are being assigned a formal transition coach or a senior mentor in the same organization? 23% are female and 28% are male, which means that men are 22% more likely to be assigned a formal mentor or an executive transition coach. These are just 3 simple examples around the gender gap that exists in today's organizations, around supporting those executives in transition, and just based on gender, there seemed to be a gap. Now, as I always do in my book, I always have a solution to this. And the solution I'm suggesting to those organizations is to make sure that whatever support they would like to provide to the executives in transition is drawn at the seniority level. So let's say if you make it to VP and above, just to use a simple example, you will be provided with a leadership skills training, a formal assessment, and you will be assigned formally a mentor or a transition coach to support you on your journey. And so again, with that one lever, you will eliminate any and all gender gaps in executive transition support.
Again, such interesting research. And as you said, this was a side finding. This wasn't the reason for the research, but very interesting and very important insights to have discovered. And I love that you came with the solution because I was going to ask you about that. So companies should build into their systems these levers, so that everyone has the same opportunities, so that it gets rid of that gender gap between males and females. Excellent. Navid, let's bridge the gap between high-level vision and grounded execution. We call this the Monday move. As an executive coach who has coached over 250 C-suite level clients or C-level clients, you are constantly observing the high-stakes stress and anxieties of the global elite. What did you do this past Monday at 9 a.m. to protect your own mental energy and ensure you remained operator ready for your clients without burning out? I don't want the coaching theory. I want the ground level protocol.
So look, I have been keeping a very regular practice since I started my coach education training 14 years ago, or 12 years ago, it was 2014, a 15-minute daily meditation. That's something that really serves me well. And as we are recording this podcast episode, I am based in Dubai and the UAE is involved in a regional conflict. We all have to find our own way to find a practice that works for us. That's what's been keeping me sane for 12 plus years. This podcast is audio only, but you and I connected briefly visually before hitting the record button. You saw that I'm wearing a Whoop band. And again, that Whoop band and the insights that it provides me with are super important indicators for me to really manage my life in a more healthy and balanced way, and not just do it based on my gut feel, but having the hardcore analytical data to be able to do that. And last but not least, it sounds very boring, but the reality is that we all are creatures of habit. And my habit, because I'm a little lazy, is to go for a 30-minute swim every day. This is a practice I've established since we moved to Dubai about 4 years ago. That 30 minutes swimming exercise really keeps me fit and helps me to switch off on the back end of a long day doing my work.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. I love that you have these protocols in place, and that 15-day meditation also helps you to stay grounded. Next is our decision inventory. We all make thousands of decisions, but a few define our journey. Can you tell us about a time you had to make a difficult decision to tell a powerful C-suite client a hard truth that they desperately didn't want to hear? What was the immediate risk to the coaching relationship? And what if that decision ultimately gained the leader in the long run?
So, see, part of what I do, part of my so-called signature year-long program is to conduct a minimum of 6 360 type interviews on behalf of my coaching client. Meaning I will connect with their line manager. I will always include their HR leader, whoever works with them closely, as well as one additional peer and 2 or 3 of their direct reports. Sometimes the executive really wants to go all in and they provide me with 10, 12, or 15 names. So that means the more the merrier. The way I go about conducting these interviews is that, with the exception of the line manager, no responses can be traced back to a particular individual. And all I'm asking for and really looking for in those interviews, without the leader being involved, is to learn a little more about their strength, their development areas. What is the one thing that they could do in the short term to maximize their effectiveness as a leader going forward? And anything else that's not being mentioned. So this is just the structure of my 360 process. And you will not believe how many insights you gain by asking these supposed simple questions. And I've refined and refined and refined those over the years. When the moment comes to connect those insights with the leader, I use a particular process. It's using a framework of another gentleman called Dr. BJ Fogg. He's a professor at Stanford, and he has come up with a very simplified one-page format that looks at start doing, continue doing, and stop doing. The continue and the stop are broken down into different areas. And so it's typically when we get to the development areas of the leader, and that follows right after the key strength, that really sometimes is coming to them as a surprise, or sometimes the honesty with which the key stakeholders have shared the feedback just hits them hard. And so, if I wanted to use a random example, I was working with the chief sales officer of an industrial business here in the UAE. And one of the stop doing things that came up during that interview process was that 3 of the 3 direct reports I interviewed on his behalf said, let's call him John Doe. John is incredible as a leader. I mean, he's really funny. And his sense of humor is beyond belief for someone at his level. It just so happens that the jokes are always at our expense and never at his own. It's a very valuable insight. It's something that is obviously a bit of a pain in the shoe of those people reporting into him. But for whatever reason, John has never had awareness or acknowledgement of this activity of his. And so again, it's a simple stop doing activity because either you stop making jokes at the expense of other people, or how about you start to include yourself in those and drink a bit of your own champagne? So this is just a silly example, but it's insights like this that really move the needle, because it's very rare that an employee comes forward and shares those insights with their direct leader if they knew that this is being shared by them in the same direct and open and honest way.
Really interesting. I love that you do it this way, that you have those 360-degree interviews, because oftentimes an executive won't realize that something he's doing could be offending or alienating people around him and thinking it's a jovial, joking guy, but it's always at someone else's expense. I'm sure that he was grateful to get that kind of feedback, because no one would ever tell that to his face directly, but also excellent ROI, because in a very short period of time, he can really shift the needle because he's now aware of something that he's doing. Really interesting. Would be a tough thing to, as you say, to tell someone, but obviously very, very valuable. Now we've come to the segment of our show where I will ask you some rapid fire questions, our version of a game show. Are you ready?
I am born ready.
For leaders stepping into a new role today, what is the most important actions they should take in the first phase to set themselves up for success? I know that sounds like a long question. I need a short answer.
So read the book of Michael Burrows and use his questionnaire to make sure you gather your own intel before you're formally starting in your role.
Excellent. What is the biggest myth people still believe about life in the C-suite?
That you have plenty of information and access to all sorts of different interesting people available to you, and that you all need to just make a decision. And that's, I think, a big myth these days.
Clarity or speed? Which is more important in the first 30 days?
So the way I would like to answer this question is I talk about divergence in the first 4 phases of the 7-phase model, meaning up to 4 to 6 months in, it's all about collecting various data points. And then from phase 5 to 7, it's moving into convergence, which means connecting the dots and coming up with 2 or 3 big, hairy, audacious goals and really relentlessly aligning the organization behind those and really having a go at them.
Excellent. Now, you've mentioned many books during this conversation, which I love. But if you had to choose, other than your own book, what is the one must read for a new CEO?
I would just step out of this transition space and recommend them to read the book that I loved reading. It's called The Coaching Habit, and it's written by Michael Bungay-Stanier. And the idea behind the book is that all leaders can be more coach-like without necessarily going through a year-long coach education training and formally training to become a professional qualified coach.
What is your go-to ritual right before a high-stakes coaching session?
I like to block my diary before and after those sessions, and I do a very little quick breathing exercise and a kind of a physical checking, and really want to make sure that when I am ready to go into the conversation, I am at my best and I'm able to serve the client in the most effective way possible.
Very good. Well, thank you for playing along. That was easy enough. Navid, we have one final tradition. We call it the green pill reflection. I'm going to ask you one thing that might feel a bit unsettling. I'm going to ask you for the truth and not the PR answer. Imagine you standing at the head of a boardroom table, looking at the founders and HR leaders of the world's top firms. You've said that leadership is a responsibility, not a status. What is the one uncomfortable truth about their current onboarding culture that they are collectively ignoring, which is actually sabotaging their best talent?
I would say invest in preparedness, not in prediction. And that is my advice to them. So invest in professional qualified support rather than hoping that the best candidate is going to wing it somehow.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Thank you so much for being here today, Navid. I've loved this conversation. Thank you for sharing your insight and your experience. Navid, for the leaders listening who are about to enter a transition or organizations wanting to properly support their executives, where is the best place for them to find your book and connect with you?
So my book is available in all online and offline book stores. It's even available in 3 very distinct short format versions. So this is really for the busy executive that may not have the time to read 242 pages. But I would say Amazon is probably your place to go because it's quite likely that it exists in your country, and it's the quickest way where you can get your hands on my book.
Thank you. And your website and social media handles?
Yeah, so Navid Nazemian is my name. LinkedIn is the only social media platform that I own, and I am responding to messages. I'm very kind generally, and also do not use a VA or an EA. So if you are writing to me or sending me a message on LinkedIn, you can expect a response directly from myself.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And we'll also put all this in the show notes. To our listeners, if today's conversation shifted your perspective on how we welcome leaders into new roles, or if it made you realize you've been onboarding on autopilot, please follow the show and leave us a 5-star review. It helps us reach more decision makers who are ready to stop the derailment cycle and start building resilient leadership cultures. Until next time, delete the defaults, lead with intention, transition with clarity, and remember that how you begin often determines how you succeed. If you enjoy our conversations, please like and subscribe. See you next Wednesday.